Chapter 5 Conmen and Mod Squad. The greatest and most consequential shift in Kansas has been within its Republican Party, where a civil war pitting moderates against conservatives has been raging for over a decade now. Republicanism has always been central to the state's identity. Kansas was founded by free soil senators who fought a running border war with slaveholding Missourians, that is, Democrats, and has not sent a Democrat to the U.S. Senate since 1932. Republicanism here has not always been strictly conservative. However, those who represented the state on a national stage, William Allen White, Alf Landon, Dwight Eisenhower, and even Bob Dole, were all from the party's progressive or moderate wing. And while the state was fiscally tight and banned what was quaintly called liquor by the drink until 1986, it also had some pretty excellent public schools, some pretty good public services, and the slightly higher taxes that paid for them. It was much closer to Minnesota than it was to Alabama. Most important, Kansas was traditionally ahead of the crowd on women's rights. Women's suffrage was first proposed here in 1867 and achieved in full in 1912. And Kansas was one of the handful of states that had reformed its abortion laws even before Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. In later years, the state's largest city, Wichita, gained the dubious distinction of being the only place in the region where a woman could receive a late-term abortion, at a clinic operated by a doctor named George Tiller. As the enrages still like to say, Kansas was the abortion capital of the nation. Kansas has always been a religious place, but when I was growing up there in the 70s and the 80s, there was not much of religious right to speak of. There were the occasional nuts, of course. When I was young, a gang of right-wing ne'er-do-wells calling themselves the Capital's Revolutionary Army robbed the Johnson County Bank and shot several policemen. But by and large, Kansas was an average and ordinary in its politics as it was in every other regard. David Adkins, a state senator who was raised in the fundamentalist Baptist in the plain city of Salina, today he is a moderate Republican, says, "I can't recall a political issue, abortion, homosexuality, any of the issues of convenience that now dominate Republican dialogue ever being mentioned in the course of my religious training or in the course of my faith." When Dan Glickman, a former U.S. representative from Wichita, he is one of that rare breed, a Kansas Democrat, served on the city school board in the 70s, he says, "Issues of ideology never came up. In the early 80s, I myself attended a hearing called by an angry parent who wished to remove a number of books from our high school library. As she ran through her list of accusations, prefab stuff that she had probably procured from the John Birch Society, the presiding administrators had trouble restraining their laughter." In the late 80s, Kansas was basking in complacency in its traditional pragmatic centricism. Two of the U.S. representatives were Democrats. Two others, one of them a woman, were moderate Republicans. Its famous UN Senator, Bob Dole, had been labeled a conservative when he ran for the vice presidency in 1976. By the time he got his party's nomination for the top job in 1996, he was solidly in the moderate camp. Kansas' other senator, Nancy Casey-Blum, the daughter of Alf Landon, could be called a liberal Republican. All through the 80s, the state legislature was dominated by traditional moderate Republicans, passing the legislation like a well-oiled machine. The state was still sufficiently unpolarized in 1990, voters could elect for only the second time since World War II a Democratic majority in the Kansas House. More important for our purposes, however, was a small band of right-winged cranks who amused the citizenry by pulling the occasional filibuster on tax legislation, suspending the rules, and otherwise tossing wrenches into the workings of government whenever the opportunities presented. In the late 80s, there were maybe 10 of these characters in the State House, one of them a pest of such damnable persistence that his colleagues nominated him for the state reptile in 1986. In 1991, though, began an uprising that would repel those reptilian Republicans from a tiny splinter group into the state's dominant political faction, that would reduce Kansas Democrats to third-party status, and that would wreck what remained of the state's progressive legacy. We are accustomed to thinking of the backlash as a phenomenon of the 70s, the busing riots, the tax revolt, or the 80s, the Reagan Revolution. In Kansas, the great move to right was a story of the 90s, a story of the present. The push that started Kansas hurtling down the reaction that was provided by the Operation Rescue, the national pro-life group famous for its aggressive tactics against abortion clinics. They called it the Summer of Mercy. The plan was to commit acts of civil disobedience all across the city of Wichita in July 1991, just as the organization's followers had done in Atlanta in 1988 and Los Angeles in 1990. Wichita was to be different, though. Here you had Tiller's Clinic, situated among a population that was world famous for its spiritual enthusiasm. Protesters meant to make this contradiction manifest, to force one aspect of the Kansas identity to clash with the other, to set up a conflict so unresolvable that everyone in the state would eventually have to choose up sides and join the fight. What allowed Operation Rescue to succeed and what made the summer of 1991 different from the previous anti-abortion rallies was the reaction of the city's clinics, which voluntarily closed up for a week when protests began. Although this disastrous strategy had been undertaken on the advice of Wichita police to certain elements of the pro-life movement, it presented a bona fide miracle. For once, they had completely stopped what they called the abortion industry in its tracks. In July and August, they descended on Wichita by thousands, spreading out over the city, chaining themselves to fences, lying down beneath cars, filling the jails, and picketing residences of abortion doctors and others they deemed complicit of the culture of death. The summer's climactic event was a mass meeting at the football stadium of Wichita State Universities. At first, organizers expected 7,000 people. They reserved only half the stadium. More than 25,000 showed up. They filled the entire complex. They spilled over into end zones. Pat Robertson took the podium and declared, "We will not rest until every baby is safe in his mother's womb." The fundamentalist media critic Donald Wildmon lashed out against liberal bias in the news. Pro-life activist Joe Snyder called for a Wichita-style protest across the country. And Operation Rescue leaders phoned in speeches from jail. One Spartacus-like moment, an event organizer asked those from out of town to stand up. According to press accounts, 2/3 of the audience did so. Then she called on Wichitans to stand, and the whole crowd got to its feet. Lawrence Goodwin, the historian of 19th century populism, proposes that the movement culture is critical to mass protest. The people need to see themselves experimenting in democratic forms. He had written that Goodwin no doubt had in mind that these were populist, huge educational gatherings and their day-long parades through tiny Kansas town, but the observation applies just as accurately as the great inverted populist frolic in Wichita 100 years earlier. This was where the Kansas conservative movement got the idea of its own strength, where it had achieved critical mass. Other aspects of that summer may be hazy now, but every anti-abortion activist I've talked to remembers the massive gathering with burning clarity. Mary Kay Culp, the Johnson County director for the anti-abortion group Kansas for Life, recalled how she and others from suburban Kansas City traveled by bus to the event. Bud Henson, the Wichita contractor who served at the time as a Sedgwick County commissioner, described the moment in the stadium as kind of an awakening. "My thought," he said, was bring on the vote. And it brung it on as they did. Tim Golba, a former president of Kansans for Life, recounted how KFL's mailing list grew by 10,000 names in the 6 weeks after the rally. In anti-abortion gatherings, Wichita conservative leaders signed up candidates for Republican precinct positions. These people were laying down their bodies on the highway, remembered Mark Getson, a Christian activist who was soon to become chairman of the Sedgwick County GOP. We said, "We admire you for your courage, for your contradiction, but we've got something a lot smarter for you to do than lying on the highway." By August 1992, Getson asserted, "We had 87% of our people in, identified firm, Operation Rescue type pro-lifers as precinct committee men and women." Moderate Kansas was horrified. Newspaper accounts of the summer emphasized the hostility of native Wichitans to deluge of outsiders. Legislation was prepared to slap the protesters back into place by mandating stiff penalties for clinic blockers and codifying the pro-choice position as Kansas law. In case Roe v. Wade was ever overturned, the legislation would have ensured that abortions would still be readily available in Kansas. In March 1992, the abortion bill cleared the State House of Representatives by a towering margin, but came to grief in the Kansas Senate a few weeks later, with much to the irritation of the state's editorial writers. The push to lock in Roe v. Wade as state law coincided, ironically, with another great journalistic theme of that year, the celebration of popular disgust of what was called politics as usual. The Wichita Eagle, a leader of the civic journalism movement, ran endless stories, marveling at the deteriorating popularity of the first President Bush, finding great significance in the defeat of various national politicians in primary elections, and conducting surveys and focus groups measuring the disaffection as election day drew near. Under the front page headline, "The People Are Fed Up," the paper mustered its best imitation of the populist outrage and declared of the people that they said they were fed up with problems, the politicians, and the system that produces both. They said that the voters' revolt is on, and they want to take back control of the system. What the paper meant by all calls to rebellion, of course, was merely that it would be nice if we all registered and voted, preferably for nice moderate Republicans who would quit fooling around and pass the abortion bill. The journalists were right about the coming voters' revolt. What they got wrong was the identity of revolutionaries. This was no moderate affair. The ones who were actually poised to take back control of the system were anti-abortion protesters. Theirs was a grassroots movement of most genuine kind, born in protest, convinced of its righteousness, telling and retelling stories of persecutions at the hands of the cops, the judges, the state, and the comfortable classes. They had no newspaper they could call their own. The Eagle, for its part, ran story after story in which experts warned against the maniacal ambitions of the Bible thumpers, but one of them did set up a Godarchy hotline, a telephone number you could call to hear recorded suggestions for actions. These nascent Kansas conservatives were also willing to work far harder than the ordinary folks to achieve their political vision. This was, and still is, critical to their success, and the conservatives knew it. The other side doesn't have an agenda, said the Godarchy guy in 1992. We have an agenda, the kingdom of God. They had lain beneath cars to stop abortion, and now they were putting their bodies on the line for the right wing of the Republican Party. Most important of all, the conservative cadre were dedicated enough to show up in force for primary elections, which Kansas are held in the distinctly unpleasant month of August. And in 1992, this populist conservative movement conquered the Kansas Republican Party from the ground up in Johnson County and Sedgwick County, and in all the other heavily populated parts of the state. They swamped the GOP organizations with enthusiastic new activist and unceremoniously brushed the traditional Kansas moderates aside. In Sedgwick County, some 19% of the new precinct committee people responsible for throwing out the old guard actually had arrest records from the Summer of Mercy. "I'm not here because I love politics," one of the activists declared on that momentous occasion. "I hate politics. I'm here because I love unborn babies. I've been in jail for the unborn." That fall, Bill Clinton won the presidency, but in Kansas, the re-energized Republican Party reconquered the legislature. One conservative novice, a carpet layer in private life, even defeated the 14-year incumbent Democrat who was then the Speaker of the Kansas House. The pro-life origins of the Kansas conservative movement present to us a striking historical irony. Historians often attribute to the withering disappearance of the 19th century populist movement to its failure to achieve material real-world goals. It never managed to nationalize the railroads or set up an agricultural price support system or remonetize silver. The argument goes, and eventually voters just got sick of its endless calls to take a stand against the money power. Yet, with the pro-life movement, the material goal of stopping abortion is, almost by definition, beyond achieving. Ask even the hardest core activists, and they will admit that there was little that can be done to halt the practice without a fundamental shift on the Supreme Court. Their movement, however, just seems to grow and grow. The material goal doesn't seem to matter. On the losing side of all this energetic growth were Kansas traditional rulers, its pro-choice Republican moderates. Although plenty conservative in the pro-business sense of the word, the Republican mods were now finding themselves under deadly, unrelenting fire from their right. Now it was they who were tasting the backlash, who were being called soft on this or that, who were charged with enabling secular humanist disease, who were facilitating the cultural rot. Now the state's traditional leaders, people who fancied themselves the most Republican in America, even found themselves taunted as rhinos, Republicans in name only, and they were furious. Candidates who had patiently worked their way up the party hierarchy for years were seeing the positions they had coveted filled instead by some wholly rolling nobody screeching against big government and interested only in doing away with abortion and taxation. The cons were organizing at their fundamentalist churches on the edges of town. They were turning out for primaries in numbers that casual Republicans could never hope to match. They were trouncing mods in races for everything from precinct committeeman to sheriff. Kansas Republicans were reaping in whirlwind. The backlash mentality that their party had encouraged so sedulously since 1968 and that had won them the presidency so many times was now howling outside their own door. The moderates deplored and denounced a Republican Party without themselves as its leaders is not a Republican at all. They said, why didn't the malcontents simply start a third party, they demanded, instead of ruining theirs? Besides, they suggested, the religious conservatives secretly harbored all manners of vileness. These cons were determined to bring segregation of a different kind, one Johnson County mod declared, and they hate, wrote a columnist for Wichita Eagle. They want women to return to a time when white gloves were required attire at afternoon teas, when women were kept in their place and by being taught that men in their lives were always knew best. In 1993, the Reverend Robert Minnelli blasted the cons from the pulpit of Village Presbyterian, a fashionable church nestled on the Mission Hills border, warning that their efforts to baptize government would one day backfire, discrediting Christianity and setting back its larger spiritual mission. For this reason, Minnelli declared the zealous cadres then taking over the local Republican Party presented a threat far greater than the old threat of communism. Minnelli was probably the most respected church leader in the greatest Kansas city at the time, and his sermon against the cons catalyzed moderate dread throughout suburbia. It led to the founding of the Mainstream Coalition, a group established to fight the religious right, and the sermon was even reprinted in the New York Times. But for the cons, being denounced by this Johnson County elder had tonic effect, confirming to them their pet belief that society's real victims were evangelical Christians. Indeed, Minelli's words can still be found reprinted today, uprooted from their context in countless conservative publications as evidence of the persecution to which true believers are subject. The prairie fire burned on. 1994 was a Republican year everywhere, and in Kansas, the cons managed to cleanse the state's congressional delegation of Democrats altogether, with Todd Tryhart upsetting the pro-choice Democrat from Wichita and Sam Brownback taking the seat of the state's other Democratic congressman who left the U.S. House to run unsuccessfully for governor. Back in Topeka, the cons now made up the majority of the Republicans in state legislature. They took all three leadership positions in the Kansas House and introduced what they called a contract with Kansas, a solemn pledge to send more convicts to the chair while defending the fetus. The moment of outright triumph for the cons came in 1996 when Bob Dole resigned his Senate seat in order to pursue the presidency. Moderate Republican Governor Bill Graves appointed Sheila Fram, his own lieutenant governor, to the position. The cons, though, had other ideas, and she was promptly clambered into the GOP primary by Poyas Brownback, who had by then become a celebrity of the conservative movement nationwide for his humble but uncompromising style. Brownback's congressional post, in return, went to Jim Runn, the praying track star. Later that year, the two remaining women in the state's congressional delegation, both mods, both pro-choice, also decided to call it quits. Abortion foes snapped up both positions, making the delegation 100% anti-abortion as well as 100% Republican. By the end of 1996, the conservatives had reason to celebrate. The state's pro-choice consensus was so hauntily in cocksure back in 1991 had been utterly rooted. The cons partied jubilantly while Dole was crowned at the Republican convention in San Diego that year. They now controlled the state party apparatus so tightly that they kept Governor Graves out of the official Kansas delegation. The national media could not help but notice the revolution in the candidate's home state, and the Kansas cons were subjects of the fawning write-ups in the Weekly Standard and in the American Spectator. The admirable Brownback was profiled by George Will and Robert Novak. The cons were the wave of the future. By the late 90s, though, the mods figured out how to push back, and the two sides settled for years of electoral warfare marked by constant escalations and verbal hostility. When the mods took back the state party organization in 1999, the cons simply set up their own parallel organization and pressed on. At Republican gatherings such as the annual Kansas Day festivity, the cons now hold competing events. Is there anywhere else where the state holiday is a partisan affair? The bitterness persists today, poisoning political activity right down to the roots of the grass. Republican precinct committee positions, the lowest office in the political hierarchy, are often hotly contested in Kansas. Primary elections for state legislature seats and even school board positions often find the defeated Republican, whether mod or con, refusing to concede and instead battling on as write-in candidate in general election. There are squabbles over yard signs and homemade slander campaigns startling in their barbarity. During the weeks leading up to the Republican primary of 2002, I saw a hand-sprawled place cards reading, "Help Homosexuals, Vote Candidate X," planted along the busy street in the outer ring Kansas City suburb of Olathe. The candidate thus implugged, a man who would be considered a stalwart conservative anywhere else in the country, explained to me that he had alienated the suburbs' leading cons 10 years previously by supporting the availability of AIDS literature in the public library. A short while later, he caught up with a gentleman planting DIY signs and discussed the matter with him over fisticuffs. All the fracturing has had a predictable effect, with more motivated con fraction dominating in the primary elections. The mods have found it expended to do the unthinkable. In Johnson County, one of the most Republican areas in the nation, some moderate Republican leaders grew so disenchanted with the ultra-conservative pro-life congressman who had been foisted on them in 1996 that 2 years later, they helped jettison him in favor of a Democrat. And when a con took the Republican nomination in 2002, much of the state's mod leadership conspicuously failed to get behind him, effectively throwing the election to the Democrat Kathleen Syllabus. This last result was so embarrassing to the National Party in a Republican year, here was ultra-Republican Kansas going Democrat, that it was prompted the Republican guerrilla Grover Nordquist had calumniated the mods as quislings and collaborators that he would deal with when the opportunity presented. It is true that total victory has far eluded the state's conservatives, but Nordquist has no reason to be so upset. The same conservative uprisings that displaced the mods also wore down the Kansas Democrats, Governor Syllabus notwithstanding, reducing their hold on the state's legislature from an outright majority in 1990 to 1992 to a mere 36% of the seats in the House and a feeble 25% in the state Senate. In 2002, 9 years after the Summer of Mercy, George W. Bush carried the state by considerably greater margin than had his father in 1988 or even Bob Dole in 1996. The pro-choice bill that passed the state's lower house in 1992 would be unthinkable today. So utterly has the climate changed on this issue that a man who ran the God Anarchy hotline back in 1992 is now, of all things, the head of the state's Consumer Protection Division. The cons have altered the state's political environment considerably, but their record as legislator was more mixed. Like their faction nationally, they have made virtually no headway in culture wars. They have not halted abortion in Kansas or secured a voucher program or even managed to keep evolution out of schools. Indeed, the issues of cons emphasized seem all to have been chosen precisely because they are not capable of being resolved by the judicious application of state power. Senator Brownback, for example, was best known for the stands that are purely symbolic, against cloning, against persecution of Christians in distant lands, against sex slavery in the Third World. Similarly, Phil Cain, the current Attorney General of Kansas, has become famous in conservative Republican circles nationwide for intervening in cases having nothing to do with age of consent and homosexual rape. These are issues that touch the lives of almost nobody in Kansas that function solely as rallying points for the con followers. They stoke the anger, keep the pot simmering, and have little to do with the practical day-to-day uses of government power. Thus they allow the politician to question, to grandstand magnificently while avoiding any identification with the hated state. In only one area would have the cons achieved tangible real-world victory. In their intractable hostility to taxes of all kinds has successfully brought disaster on the state government. After cutting taxes compulsively through the 90s or by inducing frightened mods to cut taxes in order to appease them, the cons maneuvered the state into a position where any economic downturn would have catastrophic effects on revenues. The train wreck has happened as scheduled. Today in Kansas, like any other states, is struggling with the worst fiscal crisis in recent history. Nor will the cons allow taxes to be increased to get the state out of its hole. The only route remaining is one conservatives have insisted we take all along, on the state as well as the national level. Government, that hated entity, will simply have to wither away. For most people, this may seem bad enough, but as hard times propel the state into a ditch, the fun for conservatives is just only beginning. When national correspondents come to cover the Kansas Revolution, they scratch their heads mystified. They watch one group of Republican Kansas bombard another group of Republican Kansans, and they marvel at the strangeness and sadness of the spectacle. If pressured for a sociological explanation, they will attribute the conflict that roils the state to a squabble between fundamentalists and mainline Protestants, or a fight between ignorant and the educated, or even the cons' relatively newness to modern big city ways. But above all, it is a class war. Class animus have been persistent theme in the Great Backlash since the beginning. When George Wallace railed against libertism on behalf of the average man on the street, this man in the textile mill, this man in the steel mill, this barber, this beautician, this policeman on the beat. Class animus has just as persistently been ignored by mainstream observers of the ever-growing conservative movement. The subject of social class is always disconcerting one for Americans, and most journalists find it simpler to blame the backlash on racism, sexism, or some unfathomable religious conviction than to broach this troubling topic. The mods are the worst offenders in this regard. As a rule, they do not admit the possibility that what separates them from the cons is social class. They will acknowledge the geographic divide, however, separating the older inner suburbs of the Johnson County, where the mods tend to live, from the newer outer suburbs, where everyone seems to be pro-life, pro-gun, and anti-evolution. The line between these two suburbias is so stark and so broad that Steve Rose, the editor of Johnson County Sun and the de facto leader of the mods, laments that there are today two Johnson counties. One of them is the old familiar sprawl of my childhood, the one with shady lawns and purring Porsches and schools with the highest test scores. This is the land of sensible, moderate republicanism. But the other Johnson County, personified by the outer newer suburb of Olathe, perplexes Rose. This Johnson County is cankerous and troublesome. It insists on being what he calls the bastion of right-wing conservatism, and it consistently takes the most outrageous positions on issues of today. Rose is unable to use the standard blue state, red state narrative to describe the difference between the two Johnson counties because, of course, both of them voted for Bush. So the source of the split remains a mystery. When you examine the two Johnson counties with your own eyes, though, the mystery evaporates instantly. One Johnson County lives in landscaped cul-de-sac communities with sanctuary in the traffic islands and a swimming pool behind each house and a neighborhood golf course that you occasionally glimpse from between 3-car garages. This is Johnson County. All you see in election years are yard signs cheering for Team Mod. The other Johnson County is a place of peeling paint and cheap plywood construction in the knee-high crabgrass and the shrubbery dying in the intense heat and expired cars rotting by the curb. Drive through this Johnson County and you read nothing but battle cries of the cons. The difference between the two Johnson counties is a class difference. I mean this in the material economic sense, not the tastes and values by our punditry defines class. On demographic maps of Johnson County, the hardcore right-wing parts of Olathe and Shawnee stand out for their slightly lower real estate values and lower per capita incomes. Generally speaking, People who live in these neighborhoods are probably more likely to have blue-collar jobs, and they are probably less likely to have college degrees, and they probably experience ups and downs of the business cycle with a greater sense of dread and insecurity than do the lawyers and executives of Mission Hills. Whether people in Olathe and Shawnee have more of a taste for country music or snowmobiles or NASCAR than do moderate Republicans of more affluent suburbs, I cannot say. This much is clear, though. From the elections of the past 10 years, those parts of Johnson County with the lowest per capita income and lowest median housing values consistently generated the strongest support for the conservative fraction. The areas with the highest income and highest real estate values, Mission Hills and Leawood, were just as reliably loyal to the moderate machine. The more working class an area is, the more likely it is to be conservative. This situation is the opposite of what it was 30 years ago, and is the complete and utter negation of Kansas of 100 years ago, when those hardest hit areas were the most desperate, the most radical. In Kansas, the political geography of social class has been turned upside down. When I was a kid and politics was still partially concerned with material issues, Mission Hills was a solid redoubt of conservatism, whereas Shawnee and Olathe were the parts of Johnson County most likely to vote Democratic, admittedly a rare occurrence under any circumstances. Our neighbors in the 70s liked Ronald Reagan long before Reagan was cool, and they were the kind of men who would axe half of their workforce after lunch without any second thought. And they still are. If anything, they now preside over a system in which workers have even less power, which corporate crime is even more brazen. But the context of politics have changed. So far, rightward has the spectrum moved that the people who live in the great mansions around Frank tear down find themselves closer to the center. Today, they are the financial muscle behind the state's moderate Republican faction. They are not liberals by any means. They are still too far the right on any issue having to do with taxation or the economy, and they still rally to the national Republican ticket regardless of who is at its head. They are also the ones who stand to benefit the most when the con/state taxes and agitate for the dismantling of federal regulatory agencies. But by and large, the people of Mission Hills support gay rights, they are pro-choice, and they accept the separation of church and state. Moderate republicanism has a distinct upper-class flavor to it. Mod candidates invariably raise far more in the campaign contributions than their conservative rivals. The advisory board of the Mainstream Coalition, the region's foremost mod organization, is thick with the CEOs and other pillars of the community. Its offices are even located next to a golf course, and when I visited them one time, I kept looking to see people cruising by in golf carts. So upscale is the mainstream appeal that it once sent out a mailing to encourage mods to reach out to the less educated and lower income voters. As it happens, the board of directors of the Community Foundation as Johnson County, the area's leading charitable organization, is packed with prominent mods. The two groups, mod and millionaire, interlock in so many levels that for many Kansas they are indistinguishable. When my dad's neighbor has returned from his weekly spin in the Ferrari, he will no doubt be happy to give you a lecture about the virtues of diversity. The class divide manifests itself in hundreds of ways. Consider the following vignette, described in 1998 for the readers of the Washington Post by the journalist Thomas Edsall. Bill Graves, the moderate Republican governor of Kansas, heir to the trucking fortune, and resident of Mission Hills, was facing a primary challenge of the leader of the party's conservative faction. Graves was campaigning, if you can call it that, in the comfortable Johnson County offices of Lathrop and Gage, well-connected Kansas City law firm. Satisfied Republican bonhomie was in the air as partners gathered in the 10th floor conference room of one of suburban Overland's Park's glass office towers. Then came the buzzkill. A woman stepped forward and announced to Graves' face that she wanted him to know that she would not be voting for him come election day. The brave individual who dared harsh the governor's mellow as secretary, one of the lowly worker bees in the Johnson County hive. The reason for her decision, abortion. Graves was pro-choice and hence too liberal for her taste. And that's Kansas for you, a state where the working class heroes are even more Republican than their bosses. Dwight Sutherland, Jr., a deeply conservative Mission Hills lawyer and one-time member of the Republican National Committee, is refreshingly direct about all this. This is a class struggle, he tells me. The roles have been slightly reversed. Sutherland is a caustic critic of the moderate Republicans. The way he tells the story, the mods look out at the state where working-class people are flocking to the Republican banner, swarming out of low-caste churches and lying down under cars in front of abortion clinics, and they have reacted with pure, shocked snobbiness. We are the better people, the mods are supposedly think, and we are entitled to lead this community, and we don't want uppity sorts getting in the way and interfering in the process to ratify our anointed guardians of the public. Sutherland even relates to me several anecdotes of outrageous anti-con prejudice that he has encountered at Kansas City County Club, a notorious bastion of privilege. His point is hard to miss. The halls of even the most rarefied enclaves of politicracy ring today with sanctimonious bourgeois of political correctness. The primary targets of upper-class bigotry are now blue-collar people with their funny religions and conservative politics. This is true across the country, Sutherland says. He gives me photocopies of several pages of one of those coffee table books depicting the lives and possessions of very rich people in some posh corner of the world. This one, called Brandywine, is object to adulate the fox-hunting folks of DuPont Wythe County, the region between Philadelphia and Wilmington, Delaware. The text oozes with a form of upper-class pretentiousness that would be impossible to invent. It introduces a couple who have known each other since childhood, when they whipped in for the same pack of beagles. Recently, the wife became alarmed by some local Christian coalition activism and decided to get into politics. Surprise, she is a moderate Republican who believes in gun control, women's rights, and the separation of church and state. Her bland politics, as well as euphemisms with which they are described, Sutherland suggests, are as much as a product of the family's social position as in their taste for riding hounds. The Kansas conservatives like to refer to moderate Republicans as liberals, and in their struggle with the mods for control over the Republican Party, the cons imagine they were confronting a local arm of the fabled establishment. For them, the war is a set piece right out of the works of an Anne Coulter or the monologues of Rush Limbaugh, the common people versus the haughty, know-it-all liberal power structure. The mods are plenty conservatives in their economic views, as noted previously, but they also fulfill the liberal elite stereotype if you consider are the cultural attributes of liberaldom made famous by the good-natured loathing of commentators like David Brooks. There are moderate Republicans who drink Chardonnay and put Martha's Vineyard stickers on their sobs. The mods who insist in European-style coffee and whole-grain breads and high-end chocolates. There are mods who shop Restoration Hardware and Whole Foods and who look down at those who shop at Walmart. There are mods who listen to NPR and who insist on speaking French to the waitress at a French restaurant. There are mods who will go to gay-friendly, super waspy Episcopal churches and who disapprove the Patriot Act and who will rally in support of immigrant rights. There are mods who assume that all working-class whites are racist. But such people aren't liberal. What they are is corporate. Their habits and opinions owe far more to the standards of courtesy and taste that prevail within the white-collar world than they do to Franklin Roosevelt and the United Mine Workers. We live in a time, after all, where hard nosed bosses compose awestruck disquisitions on the nature of change. Punk rockers dispense leadership secrets. Shallow profundalities about authenticity sell luxury cars. Tech billionaires build rock and roll museum. Management theorists ponder the nature of coolness, and a former lyricist from the Grateful Dead hails the dawn of the new economy capitalism for the heights of Davos. Conservatives may not understand why, but business culture has melded with counterculture for reasons having great deal to do with business culture's usual priority, profit. As corporate types, these mods are primary benefactories of the class war that rages against them. Although the cons vituperate against the high and mighty, the policies they help enact, deregulating, privatizing, only serve to make mods higher and mightier still. And while it may hurt the mods' feelings to overhear their secretaries referring to them as rhinos, the many rounds of tax cuts the cons have accomplished have surely made the string subside. The mods win even when they lose. This situation may be paradoxical, but it has also universal. For decades, Americans have experienced populist uprisings that only benefit the people that is supposed to be targeting. In Kansas, we merely see an extreme version of this mysterious situation. The angry workers, mighty in their numbers, are marching irresistibly against the arrogant. They're shaking their fists at the sons of privilege. They are laughing at the dainty affections of the Lakewood toffs. They are massing at the gates of Mission Hills, hoisting the black flag, while millionaires tremble in their mansions. They are belling out their terrifying demands. "We are here," they scream, "to cut your taxes."